Hello, this is the video for 11th grade English. This is Tuesday, November 17th. We're in week 2 of our unit on the Wild West. So the spirit of this week is about debunking the myths of the Wild West, really trying to understand why it's a myth. Today, we're looking at understand number 3. But the myth of the West is flawed. It has a one-directional falseness. That's what we looked at yesterday. It leaves out many central narratives, and it romanticizes or dramatizes narratives that were extraordinary. So here we are today. The myth of the West leaves out a lot of central narratives. And there's one narrative that is really above all others, the narrative of the Indian. We're going to look at a couple of maps to make this really obvious. So to do that, you need to open up your big Google Docs. And so I'll pretend I'm doing that alongside of you, and I'd like you to do the same. So we're looking at the second term, big Google Doc. And now yesterday, you might have notes about how the different regions of the country have histories that you can find in the state names. It's all right if you don't. Kids who are in class have that. Today, whether you're watching this video at home or after class, I want you to add in the names of 5 tribes that you recognize from the map I'm about to show you. So I'll open it up and we can take a look together. Map 2 is the one where there'll be Indian tribes that you might recognize, and here's map 1. Right, so here is map 2. An amazing map. Probably really new to you. It's a glimpse or a snapshot of all of the Indian tribes in America at a particular time. It's not to suggest that this is the way all the tribes were mapped out for their entire history, but this is a map of the general regions where you might be able to find these Native American tribes at a particular time. So what are some names of tribes that you recognize? It doesn't have to be ones that you know everything about. I'm just looking for names where you go, oh, I've heard that before. And I'd like you to think about 5. Why? To activate your background knowledge. To get you remembering and thinking about the ways that Indians were everywhere in this nation. So I'll write down a few. Navajo. I recognize that. We were even talking about that earlier this year. And then over here, I see our region, Monacan. That's familiar. Powhatan. Now that's familiar. And then other ones we might not have talked about, but that might be familiar to you. Here's the Cherokee Nation. Becomes a really important nation in the interactions that they had with the settlers. And then we're just going to scroll down a little bit, look at some of these. I recognize some of these names just for the names of cities and other places, like Muskegee. Muskegee Airmen comes to mind. So I'm just adding that in. Got the Navajo, Monacan, Powhatan, Cherokee, and Muskegee. So again, you don't have to know them from my class. It's just trying to remember, oh yeah, there is a lot going on here in the nation's map. Now let's look at this map. Same place. And the question I posed to the class is, what is the difference between these maps? What do you notice? Now, one thing I notice, you don't have to write this anywhere, we're just talking about this in class, is the huge blocks of color here. The suggestion that this is the United States of America, unified, united. This is Louisiana. This is Spanish territory. But when I look at this, there is not quite so much unity. Everything is divided. There's so many different blocks of color, so many different nations within this one giant space. Even some of these spill across the borders from the Great Basin there's a bunch of different tribes that are the Great Basin and the Plains. So a lot of this defies territorial boundaries that this suggests. There's something else going on too. This claims ownership of the land from these places, these governments. This claims ownership of the land from really small tribes. Which one is more accurate? Here, where France owns all of this space, or here, where the people living in this space own this space? What I think we can come down to is, what is the difference between the maps and why does that matter? The Native American story is so often left out of the West. Instead, we see it as America pushing these boundaries further west. But in fact, lots of people live in those places. They're settled territories. So that's one of the takeaways for class today. And I'll show you this video to emphasize that a little bit more. I know the sound is odd, just hang in there with it.
In the history of the West, Indian views are often left out because the history of the West, of course, is primarily written by American historians. Most historians are non-Native. We don't have access to Native American oral traditions, to Native American communities. We are coming from a particular perspective. Add to that the notion that, of course, history is usually written by the winners, and the losers, the people who are pushed out of the way, very quickly are relegated to footnotes. It's such an important element in American history because it's not only about how the nation expanded, but it's also a time and a period to which the United States still often looks for its values. It's supposed to be an area and a time period where our forefathers demonstrated courage, independence, expansion of freedom, and all of those kinds of things. It's almost an iconic period in American history. And I think Native American presence in that story is troubling. Because the building of this one American civilization requires the destruction Native American civilizations and the dispossession of Native American people. So if, as I think we still continue to do, we try to present United States history as a story of positive change and development for humankind. Where do Indians fit? They don't fit very well, other than people who are in the way, who are obstacles, and then have to be moved out of the way, and their stories have to be very much secondary to that main historical narrative.
So that's where we leave it. The problem with leaving Indians out from the story is that the story is not complete. The story of Indians is going to be secondary. Like it or not, we're going to see that in our novel. Chapter 3, we're going to see some first pieces of the Indian presence in Maddie's life and what that means for her. There are a couple of moments that I'm going to point to specifically where Indians show up. First, the character of Otis Wharton. He is a main driving force in Chapter 3. And you hear about him from the perspective of Rooster Cockburn, the guy who's on the stand for the longest time in Chapter 3, who Maddie is going to pay to help her hunt and find Tom Cheney. Otis Wharton is not spoken about favorably in Chapter 3, so we'll take a look at that. And then this other main idea that the conflict is going to take place in Indian territory. So what does that mean? Indian territory in the book is going to be untamed space, a space that the settlers see as wild and free, a place where they don't have dominion, and the Indians instead are going to rule that land. So there's a lot of conflict at the edges of this territory. They don't have control. And that is going to imply that they will seek control, as indeed they do, the people who are fighting for the ownership of that land. A couple of vocabulary words to look at as we head into Chapter 3. This might be familiar to you, but we'll go over it now because it does come up on the reading as well. The protagonist in a story is the main character. So in True Grit, this is Maddie. Pro, meaning for. We're fighting for her. She is our proto character. She is the one that we look for to guide us through this action. An antagonist are the forces or the people that the main character has to work against. Anti, that means against. And the prefix there is something you can hold in your mind when you're trying to remember the difference. So who is Maddie working against? And this is a lot more complicated. There are many forces and people that Maddie is working against. So we'll look into that a little bit more. All right, so chapter 3. You can see the stem there. I'm wondering what you think of the antagonists who fight Maddie in her quest. I'm wondering if you would include Indians in that yet, or the Indian territory that she's going to come across. Let's take a look at chapter 3 together. So first we're going to look at the character of Otis Wharton, because he's a clue into Indian territory. And this is the very beginning of today's section that I want you to read. I want you to finish this chapter in async time. It says, the judge rapped his gavel, and I jumped, not looking for that noise. The crowd broke up to leave. I had not been able to get a good look at that Otis Wharton, but now I did, when he stood up, with an officer on each side of him. Even though he had one arm in a sling, they kept his wrists cuffed in court. That was how dangerous he was. If there ever was a man with black murder in his countenance, it was Otis Wharton. He was a half-breed with eyes that were mean and close-set, and that stayed open all the time like snake eyes. It was a face hardened in sin. Creeks are good Indians, they say, but a Creek white like him or a Creek Negro is something else again. So we get our first glimpse at a half-Indian character. First, Maddie calls him a half-breed, which kind of shows the way that she perceives of race as animalistic in nature, that you can code people according to their breed. And that's not something that she reserves just for Indians. She kind of sees everybody as coming from either a good family or a weird half family, as she would put it. So it's a little bit troubling the way that she refers to Otis Wharton as a half-breed, but it also seems to be something that she paints with a broad brush. Later we'll meet LaBeef, and she calls him from good family. So she makes these judgments about people. But she says he had eyes that were mean and close-set like snake eyes. Clearly she sees him as very sinister. It was a face hardened in sin. So this half-Indian is going to be, for her, kind of a capturing the evil of human nature. And then she stops at the end here to make a broad, stereotypical, and racist judgment. Creeks are good Indians, they say. But a Creek white like him, or a Creek Negro, is something else again. So she's painting with a broad brush. All Creeks are good Indians. Half Creeks are bad. And that's what she thinks of Otis Wharton. So the first taste you get of an Indian in this book is not great. Otis Wharton is not a compelling character that you want to root for, and Maddie sets him up as such. She does sort of set him up as an antagonist. There's another antagonist in this chapter, and it's Rooster. Rooster is one of the characters that you're meant to not quite sure know what to do with. Either he is someone you root for or someone you root against. And I'm just going to look at this section here to show that. When Rooster Cogburn sees these people that he sees as enemies, he says, I started backing away from the axe and tried to talk some sense to him. While this was going on, C.C. Wharton edged over by the wash pot and picked up a shotgun that was lying against a saw log. Potter seen him, but it was too late. Before he could get off a shot, C.C. Wharton pulled down on him with one barrel, and then turned to do the same for me. I shot him, and when the old man swung the axe, I shot him. Otis lit out for the creek, and I shot him. Aaron and C.C. were dead when they hit the ground, and Otis was just winged. So, really quickly, in fast succession, you see Rooster Cogburn shooting and killing 2 people and shooting the 3rd. There's a real remorselessness or ruthlessness that we see in this language from him. Sets him up as an antagonist. If Maddie is this character who is supposed to give us the moral compass, Rooster is the opposite. He's telling us law is the law, and if you break the law, I don't really care what happens to you. So he is a bit antagonistic, but in a way that Maddie has this grudging respect for. Your async work is to read the rest of chapter 3. It's not long, just the last few pages here, and it's linked on the website and in the agenda. And your stems are up there as well.